Hey there, kindred spirits. Welcome to Kindred Spirits Book Club, the podcast where two grown ladies geek out about Anne of Green Gables. I'm Kelly Gerner, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ragon Duffy. Hey, Ragon.
Hello, Kelly. Hello, kindred spirits. Kelly, it almost seems quiet in the podcast studio because it's just us today.
I know, it's been so long since we haven't had a guest.
I know, and we've had so many wonderful guests
Yeah.
this year. It has been fantastic. We've learned so much, but also, hi, how are you?
Hello, friend.
What's new?
Gosh, what is new? Well, so I can give you a little bit of a house rebuilding update.
Yes, please. Kindred spirits, if you are just joining us kind of randomly through this season, you might not know that Kelly and her husband lost their entire house and all their possessions in the fires in Los Angeles not quite a year and a half ago.
Yeah, so that was bad.
That was a not good time.
That was a bad time. That was a bad time for us and a lot of folks. But now we are in a position where we get to rebuild our town, which is kind of amazing. And it's really beautiful to be a part of that. So we are getting pretty close to hiring our general contractor who's going to rebuild our house.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we have our plans all set. Our plans are pending.
Wait, did they get approved?
No. They're almost approved. We're in the final phase of approval. We really think we are going to be hearing from LA County with approval within like days, literally. I think it's going to be pretty quick. So now we are trying to get our contractor lined up. We have been going through rounds and rounds and rounds of interviews. It's so much money and it's such a big thing that's like,
yes,
we need to feel like we really trust them. So we've kind of been putting our candidates through the ringer a little bit. But I think ultimately that's an effort that will have paid off. And yeah, we think that we will probably be able to break ground within a couple months. Things are moving super quickly now. It was like very slow for a while. Right after the fire, it was very fast. There was so much to do. Then there was a lot of hurry up and wait while we sort of figured out what our next steps were going to be, and ultimately did decide to hire an architect and have them redesign a new home for us. So it's like every step of this has come in like little flurries of activity. We're right now in that other big push of, okay, we are getting these contracts signed, lining all this up and making sure the funding is ready to go as soon as we're ready to build. And it's a huge administrative hassle, and it's also very stressful because it's, again, so much money and we really just want to get this right. But I think that once this is done, once we've sort of made these decisions, we are going to be in such a great place to just sort of have the build unfold, let the experts do what they do well, and we will hopefully be home in a year.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting.
You guys deserve to have a lovely home again. Your home.
I can't wait. Everybody deserves that, but yes, we can't wait. And I know you guys have been so busy. I got to see Alice's show last weekend. She was amazing. I cried. I was genuinely like such a mess the entire time.
Yes, so that was the big one. My daughter Alice was in Newsies. She got a really big role, so she got a big solo. She also got to tap dance, and she just absolutely loved this show. And there's nothing that makes me happier than seeing her on stage doing the thing that she loves the best. You can just tell she is having the best time on stage.
It's so like deliciously fun for me to watch her. The thing that I love about her, and I love talking to her about just how she looks at her work as an actor, is she is every bit as happy whether she has a lead or whether she is in the chorus. And that happiness radiates off of her on stage. I mean, it is a delight to watch her.
Oh, and on this note about Alice in theater, is she did get into the performing arts magnet program, and she did decide to accept it.
I'm excited for her. Wow.
Yeah, that's going to be a really exciting time for her next year.
Wow.
All right.
Today, we are going to be recapping The Blythes Are Quoted. And if you are sitting at home listening to this and wondering whether or not you missed a secret 9th book about Anne, you didn't. This book is not actually a novel. It's not a continuation of Anne's story in that way. It's a collection of short stories, poems, and sort of little vignettes among members of the Ingleside household. So the short stories are all reworked versions of various stories Ella Montgomery published throughout the 30s, but now those stories have been lightly edited. They're taking place in and around Glen St. Mary, and the Blythes are not the main characters in any of these stories, but they are often referenced to, they're often quoted by the other characters. And all the poems are also Ella Montgomery's, of course, but they are usually attributed to either Anne or Walter. So what happens is after each poem, there's like a little vignette, and those are these interactions between the Blythes and Susan after a poem is shared. So that's sort of the structure of this book. This is the last book that Maud wrote, and it was delivered to her publisher on the day she died, April 24th, 1942. The publisher, for reasons unknown, chose not to publish it at that time. Some of those short stories were later published in a volume called The Road to Yesterday. That was published in 1974, but none of those little vignettes were published, and only one of the poems was published in that Road to Yesterday volume. So what ended up happening was that in 2009, The Blythes Were Quoted was finally published in its entirety, edited by Lucy Maud Montgomery scholar Benjamin Lefebvre. He did sort of a light edit for spelling and punctuation, but was really trying to keep it as close as possible to the original form.
And this book is so different and has such an odd history. We are going to be having Benjamin Lefebvre on the pod next episode in order to learn a lot more about it from him. So stay tuned for that. If you have questions, hopefully he will be answering those.
Yeah, we have questions.
But we have to do a good recap of it so that you all can understand what will be happening in that conversation. Well, before we get started, just a quick reminder that if you are not already hanging out with us on Instagram, come join us at kindredspirits.bookclub there. And while you're at it, if you've been enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, we're now on YouTube, Spotify, Pocket Cast, wherever you listen. Help us spread the word, leave a review, and let other Montgomery fans know that we're here. Another great way you can support our show is by shopping any books we recommend in our bookshop.org link. You support the pod and you support indie bookstores. And now on to our episode. So our kindred spirit of the episode is the Blythe family as a whole. Everyone in this book is obsessed with the Blythes. They are the wisest, best behaved, classiest, handsomest family in this part of the island. And if someone doesn't like them, well, then you know that is not a reliable or a good person in this book.
And for our quote of the episode, we thought we'd turn to a line from the afterword, which was written by Elizabeth Rowlands Epperly, who is one of the premier Ella Montgomery scholars. Epperly acknowledges that The Blythes Are Quoted is an atypical work, and one that may leave longtime fans of Montgomery and Anne a little dissatisfied, but she provides this context for readers that we think will be really helpful for everyone to keep in mind as we discuss today's episode. Perhaps Montgomery intended this last story of Anne to be her farewell letter to a world she knew she was leaving soon. Perhaps this is why so many of the pieces are preoccupied with finding, feeling, speaking truth, and why Montgomery is at pains to show there is seldom one truth only. Montgomery the artist triumphs in shaping this final book. There is no easy closure for Anne's story, and we care how and why this is so.
I do think that that is great context as we go forward into this book. All right, so today we are recapping The Blythes Are Quoted, and this recap will be a little bit different since it's not a novel, but a collection of poems, short stories that loosely relate to the Blythe family with little snippets of conversations between the various Blythes happening intermittently or in response to one of the poems. All of the stories in this book have a bad case of mentionitis. Kelly, do you know what mentionitis is?
I have not heard that word before. I am understanding through context.
Yes. It's kind of like when you have a crush on someone and you can't stop dropping their name all over the place. That's mentionitis, and that is a term coined by our fave, Captain Awkward.
Captain Awkward.
All of the characters in these stories have mentionitis to the max. They cannot stop name dropping the Blythes and Susan all over the place. We will not mention every single time the Blythes crop up in one of these stories because honestly, it's not usually essential to the plot. It usually doesn't tell us anything we don't already know about the Blythe family, except if we had any doubts that they are the most well-regarded family in the area, you would be sorely mistaken. Like, clearly they are. They and Susan are the authorities on pretty much everything, and everyone thinks they're awesome.
And beautiful. I don't think there's a single short story where Anne's attractiveness, her physical attractiveness is not remarked upon, or the Blythe girls are not called like the prettiest and like the skinniest and the most graceful. It's really interesting. So the book is broken into two parts, right? Part one takes place before World War I and part two takes place after World War I. However, the book begins with the poem The Piper. which Ella Montgomery herself explains that while the poem didn't exist when she wrote Rilla, many people had been asking her for it. Montgomery said of the Piper, "It has been written recently, but seems even more appropriate now than then." It's very, very short. It's just 2 verses, so we will go ahead and read it here. The Piper. One day the piper came down the glen. Sweet and long and low played he. The children followed from door to door, no matter how those who loved might implore, so whiling the song of his melody as the song of a woodland rill. Some day the piper will come again, to pipe to the sons of the maple tree. You and I will follow from door to door. Many of us will come back no more. What matter that, if freedom still be the crown of each native hill? What do you think of this poem, Ragon?
It's interesting to me that none of the signature lines that characters in Rilla of Ingleside quote from the Piper are in her poem. There's nothing about keeping faith or not breaking faith or for our tomorrow they gave their today. That seems to be quotes that characters say referencing the Piper. So it's not really the poem I imagined the Piper to be.
Yeah, it's textually inconsistent with Rilla of Ingleside.
And, we talked last episode about whether Maud was invoking like the Pied Piper or Scottish battle pipers in Walter's poem. This poem makes it very clear she's talking about the Pied Piper, kind of calling the boys away almost unwillingly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if this would have been the poem if she had written it in 1920 when she was writing Rilla, because this seems less triumphant, sadder than I would maybe expect from the way Walter's poem is really described as being like inspiring.
Right. It became like the great poem of the war. It was printed in newspapers. It was used to kind of drum up enlistment and patriotism. So I can see that Walter's Piper probably was nuanced because Walter's own views on the war were very nuanced, but his definitely seemed to be a call to action, whereas this leans heavy into that Pied Piper imagery of almost against your will. Like, I don't feel like that's the poem that we thought it was going to be from Rilla of Ingleside. One thing that's really lovely about the Blythes Are Quoted is it's actually bookended with 2 of Walter's poems about the war. It starts with the Piper, and then the last poem that is included in the book is called The Aftermath, which is also a very different poem about Walter's experience of the war, which we'll get to as well.
But let's get into the first short story, which is called Some Fools and a Saint. And this story is taking place in the neighboring town of Mowbray Narrows, and it involves the new Methodist minister, Curtis Burns. When the new minister arrives, he says he's going to start off by boarding at a home that belongs to Long Alec Field because he can't yet afford to keep up the parsonage, but he is told don't do that because Long Alec's home is haunted. Long Alec has a sister, Lucia Field, who is a special friend of Ms. Blythe. Lucia used to be a teacher in Charlottetown, and now she keeps house for her brother and she cares for her invalid cousin. That cousin is the angelic Alice Harper, who fell out of a hayloft 10 years ago and is paralyzed from the waist down. Apparently, the property is haunted, and that started after their hired girl's illegitimate child drowned in a cistern, and then the mother hung herself in the garret. So ever since then, wild things have happened in the home. Things like sounds of a rocking cradle coming from the attic, unearthly laughter, terrible pranks. Someone's beautiful hair is cut off in the night, or the glasses and cups shattered all over the floor. Curtis Burns, the new minister, thinks there is probably a simple explanation. Maybe it's their current hired girl, who is the dead girl's sister, or the simple-minded man Jock, who also lives there. So he's like, it's cool. I'm going to live here. I'm going to figure this out. 5 weeks into his stay at Long Alec's house, Curtis has seen no evidence of ghosts, and he's fallen deeply in love with Lucia Field. Curtis also enjoys Alice's company. Alice has a fun sense of humor. She never complains despite regularly writhing in agony from pain. She's slyly funny. She loves hearing all the news from the parish and everything that Curtis does. She just hates missing out. However, she doesn't seem to like Anne Blythe very much, just hinting that maybe Anne's a little judgmental, a little meddlesome.
Well, red flag.
Curtis does not like the hired girl, Julia Marsh. Curtis also doesn't care for Jock. Jock is 50 but looks 100 and is barely helpful. It gets to the point that Curtis's feelings for Lucia become apparent on his face to everyone, and then the hauntings start happening. Things like Lucia's favorite white birch is cut down overnight. Curtis hears the cradle rocking in the attic, but when he goes upstairs, not only is no one in the attic, there's no cradle. Curtis is like, I am going to get to the bottom of this. I am going to investigate. And it starts taking over his life. It is all he can think about. And then the hauntings start getting vicious. Lucia's new dress is hacked to pieces, ink splashed on the new wallpaper. And worst of all, the little kitten that Curtis brought for Lucia is hung to death.
Yikes.
Yeah, Lucia is completely resigned to it, saying that she's sad, but she says everything she loves is taken from her. She had had a puppy that Anne had given her, and that meant the same end.
What?
So Curtis's first suspect is Julia, but some incidents happen when she is away visiting family. Same with his suspicion of Jock. So he tries to enlist some folks to sit up and help him keep vigil. He gets the retired minister to come, but nothing happens that day. He asks Gilbert Blythe to do the same, and Gilbert says, no, he did that once. The haunts are too clever for him. He gets Henry Kildare to sit up with him, and Henry is the former hired man at Long Alec's farm who went out west quite a few years ago to seek his fortune and has recently returned extremely rich. Henry hears the voice of the dead field patriarch talking the night that he stays. So he's like, nope, I'm not coming back. Too spooky. It's getting to the point where it's just interfering with Curtis's work. Everyone is telling him just move out, but he wants to stay because he loves Lucia. Even Alice is telling him he should move out. But Lucia won't marry him and leave because she knows that her brother won't ever sell. And even though Curtis offers that Alice can come and live with them too, Lucia still won't leave the house. Then the haunts start targeting Curtis himself. They cut buttons off all his suits. They destroy his sermons. And since he's kind of feeling like Lucia doesn't really return his affection, she's not interested in leaving, and she doesn't seem like she cares if he stays or not, he's like, okay, fine, I'm going to move out. He announces it to the family, and he updates Dr. Blythe about all of these developments and says he is leaving with the mystery still unsolved. So Curtis is working on moving out, and he goes to his district meeting, I assume in Charlottetown. He misses his usual train back, so he ends up taking this very late train home. He has to get off at the Glen station at 1 a.m. and ends up walking the 3 miles home with Henry Kildare, who is also on that same train. It's a long walk. Henry is chatty, and Henry says he is going back to the West Coast because it turns out he came back for Alice, and now he can't have her. Henry says he worshipped Alice when he was young, but he didn't think he could get her because he was only the hired man, and she never knew how he felt. When he got rich, he came back thinking maybe he'll see if Alice was married yet, but while he was out west, that's when she fell and was paralyzed, and he hadn't heard about that accident. So I'm assuming that Henry is assuming that Alice can't marry him because she's bedridden. They're walking along in the dark. They get close to Long Alec's farm, and the moon comes through the clouds and illuminates the orchard. And all of a sudden, they see a slender, light-clad figure standing among the trees. Yeah, the men are like, that's got to be it. That's our ghost. So they chase the figure, who runs away, runs towards the house, and darts in the front door. The wind slams the door shut, catching the skirt of the ghost fast in the door. They race up, free the skirt, open the door, and find out that it's Alice, her face distorted with rage and hatred. So they hustled her into the parlor to figure this out before they wake the rest of the household. Turns out that Alice is absolutely riddled with jealousy and envy and a paranoid kind of resentment. She always felt like the poor relation in the family. She felt like Lucia was petted and spoiled, got everything that Alice always wanted. Henry, who had been working there at the time, he pushes back a little bit on some of the way that Alice is talking about these, reframing them into the size and context of the actual event, so you can tell that Alice has twisted this way out of proportion. Alice says that when she fell from the hayloft, she was paralyzed at first, but gradually the feeling came back in her legs, and she realized she could rule the household from her bed. So she pretended to continue to be paralyzed. She even fooled the doctors, but she thinks Dr. Blythe might have suspected. Lucia had to come back from her career in Charlottetown, give up her career to nurse her. And so now Alice finally felt important, the center of the family. Henry says, well, she was always important to him. That was news to Alice. She's like, well, if I had known that, I might have even married you because I could have humiliated my family by marrying the hired man.
Oh boy, Alice.
She goes on to say she made everyone wait on her while she was gaining the reputation for being the angel of Mowbray Narrows. She'd have terrible attacks of pain that required Lucia to stay next to her anytime she felt like Lucia needed a little discipline. And she came up with a haunting idea when Long Alec wanted to get married, because she knew that meant that Lucia could leave and the new bride would never wait on her hand and foot like Lucia was doing. So it turns out there are loose boards in her closet that separate her closet from the garret stairs so she could sneak out that way, but her door would still be locked. She'd make noises in the garret by rocking a loose floorboard and then hiding in a trunk full of blankets when anyone came up to investigate.
Oh
She has quite a
boy.
talent for acting, so she would imitate dead people's voices, and she loved to torment Lucia in particular by making messes for her to clean up or destroying her things.
Oh boy.
Yeah. When Curtis came, she loved his company, so she didn't act as Ghost for a while, so he would stay. But then he fell in love with Lucia. Can't have that. Lucia's not allowed to
Nope,
be
nope.
happy. So Alice started up again to make Curtis moved out. So Alice is resigned now that the gig is up. She's sure she's going to be turned out of Long Alec's home. And Henry's like, nope, not so fast. I'll marry you and whisk you right off to the West Coast tonight, right now.
I have so many questions about Henry. He hears all this and he's like, you know what? Yes.
Exactly. He's like, I've wanted you all my life. Now I can have you. He's kind of got the upper hand.
This is the kind of very stable person I would like to spend the rest of my life with.
He's like, yeah, none of this makes a difference to him. So they leave in the middle of the night. Curtis has to tell everyone the truth in the morning.
So Alice never even says goodbye to Lucia.
No, she just
never comes clean.
Nope. He's like, don't worry. No consequences. Let's just go.
No consequences. You and I get to have a cool life out west.
So the truth now comes out. She's gone. Dr. Blythe says, of course, he always suspected something was up with her, but thought maybe she was in cahoots with the hired girl. Anne says she could never endure her because, quote, there was something in her eyes and I knew she hated Lucia. And all is well. Curtis knows now that Lucia will marry him. So good job.
Really, really weird story. It's such a strange place to start this book. I do love that it's like a little bit, we're coming back to like some of our spooky Windy Poplar's roots. It has all the trappings at the outset of like a good gothic ghost story, but then takes a real, well, maybe there's like a little mad woman in the attic, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe we can just kind of, if we like recontextualize this.
I don't know, but like strangling kittens and puppies is not a deal breaker for Henry.
Did Henry have all the facts? Did he know about the strangled kittens and puppies?
She tells him.
Oh man, maybe Henry's like, you know what? That's the kind of no nonsense lady I need out in the wild, wild west.
He must be deep in love. So then we get a little interlude at Ingleside. So this is where you're going to see this is the structure of the book going forward. It explains that Anne gave up writing stories when her children were young, but she still wrote poetry and sometimes reads her poems to the family in the evening. In this case, they're commenting on the poem. So the first poem is a very sweet one called I Wish You, and it's the author wishing lovely things for a friend. Like Gilbert is thinking about the House of Dreams, and we hear Susan's thought that she's never had a home of her own, but she is needed here at Ingleside, especially by Shirley. And she references there being 5 children of Ingleside, so apparently Maud forgot about Rilla. That's one of those mistakes that they specifically kept in that Maud made in this book. There's a couple of them that sort of show up. And then there's a couple other poems in there. They're all sort of on the theme of home and place.
So then we get the short story, An Afternoon with Mr. Jenkins. This story is from the point of view of 8-year-old Timothy, who is supposedly a friend of Jem Blythe's. And Timothy lives with his 2 old maid aunts. Now, Timothy name drops Jem all over the place, right? Mentionitis. And Timothy has also noticed that his aunts are very worried about something, but he doesn't know what specifically. This morning, they received a letter that made them turn pale, cry, and hurry off to Charlottetown. They canceled the planned lake trip for today, leaving Timothy at home alone. Timothy is bored and hanging out on the gate, watching the cars and buggies going by, when a strange man chats him up, a handsome, well-dressed man who looks cross and inquires if his aunts are at home. He claims to be an old friend. Timothy volunteers this information that his dad is dead. He doesn't even know what he looks like because there's no picture. And according to Timothy, his dad was a brave man, a soldier in the Boer War, but his aunts won't talk about him. He says that his mother died when he was born. They also chat a little bit about Timothy's aunts, that they're a little strict, but they do let him have a dog even though they don't like dogs. Timothy shares that he's afraid of the dark, and so having the dog helps. The man mentions that Timothy's mom was afraid of the dark too, which like, okay, how do you know that? Then the man invites Timothy to go to the lake with him for the day. When the child protests that his aunts told him not to leave, the man insists that they meant he's not to leave alone and that he'll be with him. He said Aunt Kathleen would, quote, think it quite lawful to go with me. I was like, no one has had the don't talk to strangers conversation with Timothy. So Timothy, but he can't resist the lure of a lake day, of course, and the man tells him his name is Mr. Jenkins. They have a great time, merry-go-rounds, then he takes him out to dinner in an expensive restaurant, and they're just enjoying some of this man-to-man company. Mr. Jenkins shares that he's been thinking of a quote, friend of his who embezzled a lot of money and was sent to prison for 10 years. He's only recently gotten out early for good behavior and found out that he's now rich because an uncle died and left him an inheritance. Mr. Jenkins is afraid that his friend is branded now as a felon and that his wife's sisters will never forgive him. He says his friend spent all those years thinking about how to get even with those sisters by taking something from them that they want to keep, and that his friend is very lonely. Are you picking up what this man is putting down? Yes. Timothy's like, oh, that sounds hard.
Oh, I'm so sad for your friend.
So Mr. Jenkins is ready to take Timothy back home, but Timothy wants to use the last of his pocket money to buy flowers for the soldiers' monument in honor of his father. He explains that he wasn't killed in the war. He came back and married Timothy's mother and was in a bank and then died. Mr. Jenkins adds, I fancy he'll stay dead. And Timothy thinks this is kind of a weird thing to say, but he likes Mr. Jenkins. So Mr. Jenkins says he won't be seeing Timothy again. He's going to accompany his lonely friend to a new land, but he gives Timothy a message for his aunts. He says to tell them not to worry about the letter they got this morning. The person who wrote it has changed his mind and won't bother them again, as long as they don't make Timothy do music lessons and let him sleep with the light on. He mentions in passing that he went to college with Dr. Blythe, so he can help if Timothy needs it. He then tells Timothy not to go off with strangers like this, though, and the stories end with Timothy squeezing his hand and saying, but you aren't a stranger. Very Little Elizabeth coded, right?
It's like Little Elizabeth, but kind of flopped, like opposite. So then we move on to what's called the second evening, which is another night of Anne's poetry with her family. And kind of continuing with the theme from the first group of poems, we have the poems The New House, Robin, Vespers, and Night. The Ingleside adults are kind of chatting a little bit about them, and then we hear Jem yell in the window asking for more pie. And Susan's response, ain't that like a boy? I wish Walter was more like that.
Okay, Susan.
That's gratuitously mean.
Gratuitously anti-Walter content will not be sanctioned on this podcast.
No, there are so many references, and we won't mention all of them. Most of the time, they're not actually relevant to the plot, but there's a lot of references sprinkled throughout part one about Walter being seen as a poet and as a sissy. Sometimes this is in a negative way, like this, but sometimes some of the characters admire this about Walter. So it seems like it's kind of widespread knowledge amongst the community.
The next poem, called Man and Woman, is actually two matching poems. The man asking the woman to be the only one she's ever loved, and the woman's response saying she knows others may have come before, but asking that none come after her. And this poem is like vaguely implying sort of like a sexual or like erotic connection here. It's kind of scandalous for Maud. And Anne shares that, well, you know, I wrote it at Redmond and it was never published. And then she sort of reassures Gilbert that he was the first. But what is very interesting is that Susan firmly says that Anne did not write that poem. Like, that just doesn't work with Susan's worldview of Anne. Then that poem must have just gotten mixed up in some old papers of hers. While Gilbert teases that at least her first wasn't Charlie Pye, which is interesting. That definitely seems to be a mistake of Maud's that they left in the editing.
The next story we have is one of the darker stories in the book. It's called Retribution, so it tells you right from the outset. And we open with elderly Clara Wilcox on her way to see David Anderson before he dies because she has 40 years worth of things to save him. Clarissa is going to avenge her sister Blanche. Clarissa arrives at David's home just as she sees Dr. Blythe leaving because there's nothing to be done for David now. And it's clear from Clarissa's reflections that her sister Blanche was romantically entangled with David Anderson at some point, but he actually married a woman named Rose, who is also now dead. Clarissa kind of heads into the house when nobody is looking. The nurse is outside talking to Dr. Blythe, and she finds David alone on the bed. His eyes are closed, but she is sure that he can hear her. And she lays into him, saying all the things she has wanted to say for 40 years. She accuses him of ruining her sister Blanche, who got pregnant out of wedlock with his child, and Blanche died in childbirth. David thought that the baby had died with Blanche, but it turns out he lived and they sent him off to live with a cousin, and David never knew that his son was still alive. When the boy was 17, he came back to Lowbridge, and all unknowing, David gave him a very poorly paid job in his shipping office. About 2 years into this arrangement, the son stole some money. David's partner wanted to overlook the matter, not wanting to ruin this young man's life, but David pressed charges, and his son went to jail. And when the boy came out 5 years later, he was a criminal. Clarissa says that when David is dead, she will make this public so everyone can see his hypocrisy and he will be the talk of the town. But Clarissa's not done. She's got more dirt. She tells him that the woman he did marry, Rose, actually loved a man named Lloyd Norman and was unfaithful to David with Lloyd. She says the rumors are that the boy that David thinks is his son is really Lloyd's son. Clarissa viciously tells him she's going to spread this news, and she clearly has a complex about which family is looking down on hers and which family she's looking down on herself. She hints that Dr. Blythe and Mrs. Owen Ford might be having an affair, so you know she's not a reliable narrator. Clarissa finally runs out of steam. She feels like her revenge is complete, and just as she's noticing that the nurse is returning to the house, she can feel a change in the room and realizes that David has died in the midst of her screed here. And all of a sudden, she feels limp and empty. Clarissa leaves. She's worn out. She feels foolish. And her last reflection, she says out loud as she walks, I wish I were dead. I loved him so. Oh, I always loved him so.
Oh.
From the time we were children at school, I hope he didn't hear me. Oh, God, grant that he didn't hear me, but I shall never know.
This story is quietly devastating, I feel. Well, so the next set of poems follows under the heading The Third Evening. The first poem is called There Is a House I Love, and Anne says that the house is a composite of Green Gables, the House of Dreams, and Ingleside. Sea Song is inspired by all the myths of the sea from Captain Jim, and Susan opines that that is a bad example for Walter. Okay, Susan. So then the next short story that we hear is called The Twins Pretend, and Nan and Di Blythe are the children being name dropped in this story, and Susan Baker as well, but they're not the twins in question. That would be 10-year-old twins Jill and PG, who are visiting with their mother from out west so their mother can take care of Aunt Henrietta. The twins are bored and quarrelsome when they run into a mysterious older man named Anthony Lennox that Jill thinks looks like a remorseful pirate. Turns out that Anthony Lennox is the millionaire publisher of a Canadian-wide string of magazines and is back in the area where he has an unexplained past for some rest and relaxation. As they get to talking about the pretend games that the kids like to play, Jill says that her favorite game is to pretend to be very rich, and then she would buy an abandoned house nearby that she has named Orchard Knob. Hilarious name. The kids explain all the things that they would do to fix up the house, including adding a swimming pool and a tennis court. Anthony Lennox said that they should do that. Turns out the house is his. He's been away for 15 years and was planning to sell it anyway, so he'll fix it up. He says he'll furnish the cash and the twins can do the planning, and then they will have something fun to do.
Okay, wait. Kelly, as somebody who is about to embark on this very project, does this sound like a fun summertime camp experience?
I think that doing any major home renovation is inherently stressful, but if you are the millionaire publisher of a Canadian-wide string of magazines, I think if you have like unlimited funds, it actually can be very fun.
Sure.
And if you are like a normal person trying to do the best you can with a very limited budget, it's very stressful.
Well, if any millionaires of a Canadian-wide string of magazines would like to finance my
rebuild, they are welcome to. Please call me.
Exactly. you could have a swimming pool and a tennis court.
I would love both. But I will say, regardless, whether I was a millionaire or not, I would not let 10-year-old twins helm my renovation in any universe. So I think that's interesting as well. But I do love that they get to do their own sort of extreme makeover home edition with this guy's property. So when Anthony asks the kids if their parents will mind them doing all this, they say, we have no parents. They explain their father died when they were babies, and they sort of like wave off their mother because she's so busy taking care of Aunt Henrietta that the twins generally entertain themselves. So, Anthony calls out that rampant mentionitis of the twins in regard to the Ingleside crew by saying, if you mention Susan Baker's name to me again, I will pick up one of these nice round stones and go down to Ingleside and lay her out flat. And then do you think the Blythe girls will like you? And like readers of the book, this man is also getting sick of it.
Exactly.
And this is an empty thread because, of course, Anthony also has a connection to the Blythes and says that he knew Anne and Gilbert in college. Anyway, Jill badgers Anthony into telling them why he left for so long. It's an unrequited love affair. There had been a girl who was a childhood friend, and they fell in love as they grew up. When he had gone abroad for his education, he had given her a ring, and she promised to wear it as long as she cared for no one else. When he returned 3 years later, he saw that she wasn't wearing the ring, and he was too proud and too hurt to ask why. So he shut up this place and he went away. The twins call him out, correctly I think, for not just talking to her directly, because there could be lots of explanations for why he didn't see the ring, and that any gossip that she loved someone else should have been verified directly with her. Good advice, twins. So they spend the next several weeks in a flurry of activity over at Orchard Knob, and that's amazing that all that construction goes without a hitch, so good for them. Jill takes charge of directing the workmen in regards to the house itself, and as to furnishing and decorating the house, Jill is 10. PG, also 10, is in charge of directing the work on the swimming pool and tennis courts. So, but by the end of the summer, the house is done. So our 10-year-old project managers, I guess, knew what they were doing. And Anthony even has a possible offer on the house already. Jill's sad about all that, but she knows that if Anthony is going to leave anyway, it would be better if someone is using the house than to have it all shut up again. They decide that they want to have a housewarming for the house before that happens. So the twins invite the Blythes, their mother, and some other folks they knew. The house is full of light and life when folks start arriving, and Anthony goes stock still, seeing what he supposes is a dream. It's his lost love coming across the lawn. It's the twins' mother. The twins had not told their mom Anthony's name when they told her about this project, and since she'd never heard of the house called Orchard Knob, because that's a name the kids made up, she never connected it to Anthony until just now, and it turns out that had all been a terrible mistake. The twins' mother, Betty, had heard rumors that Anthony was in love with someone else, so she was wearing the ring on a chain around her neck and not her finger, and then Anthony had never talked to her, he had just disappeared. Craziness. So they never sorted it all out. When Betty's family moved away, Betty met the twins' father, who was nice and kind, and she married him. But now, Jill can stay in the house she loves, because Anthony will be the twins' new father, the very thing they had been pretending in their heads all summer.
Very nice. That one's not a dark story at all.
Very cute. I would read a full book of this if this was expanded out. I think it would be cute.
In the fourth evening, there is a poem called To a Desired Friend. And in response to this poem, Walter thinks to himself that he hopes he will have a friend like that someday. And then we get this from, quote, a voice no one hears. You will, and his name will be Death. And then Susan says she shivers like someone is walking over her grave. So that's creepy.
Maud, what are you doing?
I know. Walter's best friend will be Death. Ugh. The next story is Fancy's Fool. It's from the point of view of Esme, who is a young woman on the verge of marrying a man called Alardus. But Esme is haunted by the memory of a man called Francis from when she was a child. Alardus is showing Esme around his family's summer home when Esme sees a picture of a man who looks just like her memory. And it turns out this is Alardus's great uncle Francis Barry, who died at sea at only age 17. So Esme's like, whoa, that's weird. And now she's afraid she's like her strange Aunt Hester, who spent Esme's childhood wandering the family's summer home of Birkin trees after her lover died. There was a locked garden at Birkin trees, and the family lore is that long ago a little girl went into it and never came out. One night, when Esme was a child, she sees her Aunt Hester gliding across the lawn, gowned in white, pearls in her hair, and Hester tells Esme that this was going to be her wedding dress. And she takes her with her to the locked garden, and there is someone in the garden. It's a young man that Hester calls Jeffrey. Esme is at peace in the garden, and Hester and Jeffrey just walk and talk all night. And Hester tells Esme that she will bring her again to the locked garden, but they can only come on moonlit nights. So several times during the summer, Hester takes Esme to the garden, and that's where she meets Francis, a young man who becomes a wonderful friend to her. They dance and laugh together, spend lots of time talking together. Esme's relatives start to worry about her because she's kind of living in this dream state, just waiting for moonlit nights. Even Dr. Blythe is concerned and tells her family they need to take her away from Birkin trees. Before they can do that, though, Aunt Hester dies quietly in her sleep, smiling and happy. And Esme has not been back to Birkin trees since then. So once Esme sees this picture of great uncle Francis in Alardus's home, she feels like she has to tell all of this to her fiance. Like, it's very weird. He doesn't take it seriously. He says, oh, she was just a lonely, imaginative child, and Aunt Hester influenced her. Maybe Esme had seen the picture when she was young on a visit to Alardus's house, and it became a visual for a daydream. Esme's like, nope, this means something. I can't marry you. Maybe I'm too crazy to marry you. And she decides she needs to go to Birkin trees again for herself, just to see if it was a dream or not. She walks 3 miles there, and she seeks out the garden. The walled garden door is hanging open, and she wanders in, and suddenly, through a gap in the old stone wall, she sees someone coming up the steps from the river. He gets close, she recognizes him, and she gasps out, Francis! But he's not Francis. He's a distant cousin of Alardus's named Stephen Francis, who has recently come to the area to take charge of a science station at the harbor. And then the narrator throws in that sometime in the future, Stephen will share a German prison with Jem Blythe.
Oh, grim.
After they sort of sort out, he's not a ghost, Esme's not engaged to Alardus, the two of them sit down for a long time in the garden, and we are told that they just suit each other.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say about that one. Like, it almost,
It's a little lackluster for me.
yeah.
This one did not make much of an impression on me, I'll be honest. So the fifth evening has Anne sharing some fanciful romantic poems that she wrote in college. And then the next story is called A Dream Come True. Now, this is about the elderly couple Anthony and Clara Fingold, where Anthony is having a bit of a crisis about his life not being interesting enough that somehow revolves around the question of wearing pajamas to bed. Pajamas being a new and somewhat suspect modern trend in men's sleepwear. So
Yeah.
Clara wants Anthony to get with the times, and Anthony is like, no, nightshirt for life. In spite of the fact that he had just been talking about how he had never had enough adventure in his life and didn't try new things. So now, as a selling point, Claire lets him know that apparently Dr. Blythe wears pajamas, so he is doing the modern thing. And Jimmy Flagg, and maybe even the minister, right? These modern men among Glen St. Mary. So Anthony decides he'll go down to the Glen and see if the minister has pajamas hanging from his washing line.
He's going to spy on the minister's laundry.
This is real nutty stuff. On his trip down to the Glen, he detours through the Upper Glen Road to perhaps catch a glimpse of Caroline Wilkes, Anthony's childhood crush who married a rich man from Montreal, but is currently here for the summer. He's fond of his wife, but he's been worshipping Caroline from afar his whole life, and he even subscribes to the Montreal paper to see her name in the society pages. As he's walking by her summer home, the caretaker comes rushing up to him, having just got word that his daughter is having a medical emergency. He asks Anthony to come sit in the house until Caroline's son is back. She's laid up in bed asleep, struggling with a heart condition. He says she will be asleep, having just had some medication, so won't be having any spells. So Anthony stays and sort of relishes the thought of being so near to Caroline after all these years, when all of a sudden she appears in the doorway. Quote, a raddled old dame in a flannel nightdress. Thin gray hair hung in wisps about her wrinkled face, and her mouth was drawn inward over toothless gums. And she's carrying a dagger.
Sorry, this is funny.
Not what Anthony was bargaining for. She recognizes Anthony and she knows that he was in love with her. Anthony's dreams fall apart in that moment. Caroline tells him that she hung the hired man in her closet. Whoo boy. Caroline laughs and taunts him to kiss her, and when he doesn't, she corners him and kisses him herself. Caroline had heard the rumors that Anthony's wife wants him to wear pajamas, threatens him with the dagger to go upstairs, and makes him put on her son's pajamas. What? She comes back all dressed and threatens him again to get in the car with her. She drives fiendishly all over the area through hedges and brooks and potato fields until they finally crash over a bridge into the creek. They're both unhurt. The spell is over. Anthony takes off running with a bag that had fallen out of the car in the crash and runs all the way home. When Anthony finally gets home to Clara, his wife, Clara is absolutely frantic because she's heard all of these stories from various witnesses to this bizarre scene from all over the neighborhood. First of all, she freaks out that he wore pajamas for Caroline, but not for her, and she says it's common knowledge that Caroline's been crazy for years. She just never mentioned it to Anthony because she knew he was in love with Caroline. Anthony tells her the whole story, and then they think to look in the bag, and there is a ton of cash in the bag that he grabbed. So it turns out there had been a bank robbery in Charlottetown. There's a reward for the capture of the bandits or the recovery of the money. So they sort of suppose that the bandits had thrown the money out of their own getaway car, and by coincidence, they threw it to where Caroline had crashed the car. Who knows? Anyway, Anthony resolves to make it all up to Clara, his true love, by buying pajamas and, doing some of those chores he's been putting off.
It's such a wild story.
This one at least is really funny.
On the sixth evening, we get the poems Farewell to an Old Room, The Haunted Room, and Song of Winter. And in the commentary of the poems, it kind of involves Anne and Gilbert filling the kids in a little on the trajectory of their love story. And then the kids start teasing each other about how Jem has kissed both Faith and Mary Vance.
Okay, Jem.
That's a love triangle that never got fleshed out.
And I think we're the poorer for it.
Then there's the short story, Penelope Struts Her Theories. 35-year-old Penelope Craig is a recognized expert in child-rearing science, and a group of ladies are gossiping with surprise about her intention to adopt a child, insinuating that she's all theories, no practice, especially with her intention to adopt an 8-year-old boy who is the son of an old school friend of hers who has recently died. The ladies gossip to Anne that Penelope doesn't hate men, but she kind of can't be bothered with him, and that a Dr. Galbraith has been proposing to Penelope for over 10 years, kind of off and on. And then the ladies are laughing about her various child-rearing theories, which honestly sounds like she just believes in natural consequences and not whipping kids. And there's lots of talk about like a boy needs masculine energy, especially because he was raised by a widowed mother up until this point. But Penelope is undeterred. Lionel arrives, and he's a blunt, oppositional child. He doesn't want to call Penelope aunt. He doesn't want eggs. He doesn't want to be called darling. He just sits on the porch all morning because there was no sausages for breakfast or lunch or dinner. He's like, I'm not going to eat if it's not sausage.
Oh, what a charmer.
Yeah. So you kind of get the vibe that Lionel's sort of a difficult kid. The first 2 weeks are rough. Lionel will only eat as long as there is sausage or bacon on the table. He won't make friends with any of the neighbor kids. So he's clearly unhappy. School doesn't start for 2 months, so he's not going to get to meet other kids. He won't play with any of the toys or the swings. So Penelope decides he needs a friend, and despite the Blythe boys being the best behaved kids she's ever seen, they're too far away for daily fun. The way she's going to solve this problem is just to get another boy for the summer to keep him company.
Oh boy. Again, the way kids get traded around in these books.
I know, it's kind of a wild way to solve that problem. Theodore Wells is about the same age as Lionel, and he is the nephew of a local man. His mother is an actress. His father died, and the uncle who took him in has just died. So that aunt has enough on her plate, and she's like, yeah, go stay with Penelope until she can reach his mom to let his mother know what has happened. Upon meeting each other, the two boys instantly get in a fist fight, so not off to an auspicious start. But they find some common ground in singing some rather terrible songs. But then they're fighting again the next day. Penelope is horrified by the fighting, but Marta's like, this is healthy for boys. Boys do this. So they kind of, over the summer, develop this rough and tumble kind of friendship where they're fighting, but they are also fishing together. They're getting up to mischief together. Theodore has a really quick temper, but at least he's charming and smiley. And Penelope convinces herself that the messes they're getting up to are worth it. Their pranks sort of ratchet up in severity, and Penelope is getting a ton of phone calls from around the neighborhood about all the havoc they are causing. But sometimes Lionel is now actually smiling at her, and he starts calling her Aunt Penelope. Marta still thinks they need a man, though. Well, one evening, Lionel comes running in a panic, saying Theodore jumped off the roof, and he's afraid that Theodore's dead. So Penelope runs out to Theodore, who is lying like boneless on the ground, and just as she gets to him, Theodore's mother, the actress, arrives and comes sweeping up the walk, throws herself dramatically on Theodore, accuses Penelope of neglecting her child. And it seems like Maud is thinking that this woman is out of order, but honestly, if that was my kid and I walked up to that, I might also be upset. Luckily, Dr. Galbraith and Dr. Blythe happen to be driving by. The doctors seem not super concerned about Theodore despite his mother's histrionics, and it's very quickly revealed that Theodore has been faking this whole time to get back at Lionel. He never jumped off the roof. He just made him think that. Dr. Galbraith announces that things have gone far enough. This is a bridge too far. There is going to be discipline in this house. He tells Penelope they will be married in 3 weeks, no arguing, and then he marches Theodore off for a thorough spanking. Theodore's mom is appalled by this, but Penelope says Theodore has had several spankings coming to him. She's been a fool to not spank him, I guess. And she tells Theodore mother's, great, take him. My nerves are shot. And his mom's like, oh, actually, well, I can't really have my career as an actress and have my child with me. She just wanted to come and make sure he had a good home and a loving mother. So bye.
Boy.
Dr. Blythe says his own sons get up to trouble too, but they have 3 adults around to correct them, and he spanks them when they deserve it, as long as Susan's out of the house. And he says that most of Penelope's theories are good, but they agree that every once in a while a spanking is required. So Dr. Blythe is glad that Penelope will be marrying Dr. Galbraith, and the boys are glad too. So it all ends happily.
It all ends happily with apparently a few more spankings in the future.
Yeah. And these boys, much like Anthony Pye and Anne of Avonlea, sort of agree that they deserve a good spanking now and then.
So now we're moving into the 7th evening, and this contains poems called Success and An Old Face, and both of those are sort of reflections on life from the point of view of men looking back on their lives. And the next short story is called The Reconciliation. Miss Myrtle Shelley is inspired by a sermon by Reverend Meredith about forgiveness, and so she's on her way to finally forgive Lyle Stevens for stealing Ronald Evans from her 30 years ago. Myrtle and Lyle had been childhood besties, Lyle always much prettier than Myrtle, but one summer, while Lyle was out of town, Myrtle met Ronald Evans while he was visiting. She loves him instantly, and it seems like her affection is returned. Then, when Myrtle turns up at the barn dance ready for a romantic evening with Ronald, she sees him dancing with Lyle, who had just returned from her visit that very day and had not heard that Ronald and Myrtle were seeing each other. Ronald totally ignores Myrtle, and when Lyle bumps into Myrtle, Myrtle slaps her in the face and stomps off. Lyle had no idea what had happened, and after a few weeks, Ronald left town and then Myrtle and Lyle haven't spoken since. Long time to hold a grudge. So Myrtle walks all the way from the Glen to Lowbridge, and she turns up at Lyle's house. Lyle doesn't even recognize her at first, and then she does invite her in, reminiscing merrily about their friendship and their youth. She asks why they ever quarreled years ago. She says she can't really remember. And Myrtle prompts back to her that she took Ronald Evans away at the Clark Barn dance. Lyle doesn't even remember Ronald Evans particularly, but gradually the memory does come back to her. She hadn't thought of him in forever. She even forgot that Myrtle had slapped her face until Myrtle reminds her. Lyle said, "Did you really?" "Well, yeah, yes, I believe you did. I'd forgotten that part of it." "Well, never mind sitting on the mourner's bench now about it, honey. Forgive and forget has always been my motto." Well, this response is very shocking to Myrtle. Here she is being forgiven when she was the one who came to offer forgiveness. She can't take it. She stands up and deliberately slaps Lyle hard. "You didn't remember that first slap? Perhaps you will remember this one."
God, Myrtle.
Then she walks all the way home in satisfaction. Quote, "She had seldom done anything that gave her such a sense of not having lived in vain."
Oh my God. What's funny is this is almost like the flip of that story of like Clarissa Wilcox unloading on David Anderson and feeling unsatisfied. She's like, I held that grudge and I feel great about it. Would slap again. 5 stars. Oh my God.
Absolutely bonkers.
So our next story is The Cheated Child, and it is about a young 8-year-old boy named Patrick Brewster who is dreamy and sensitive like Walter Blythe, who is our name-dropped inspiration in the story. Patrick is an orphan whose Uncle Stephen has just died. Uncle Stephen was his guardian. Rich Uncle Stephen did not like Patrick at all. And so Patrick grew up living in kind of a dream world as a coping mechanism all his life. So Uncle Stephen's will has declared that in the short term, his lawyer will be Patrick's guardian, but long term, Patrick will live with one of his uncles or aunts. And whichever one that will be will get $2,000 a year for his upkeep until Patrick is 21, at which time Patrick will inherit the rest of Uncle Stephen's money. But the way this is going to work is that Patrick will get to choose which relative he will live with. Once he makes his choice, it cannot be changed. So he is supposed to go live for 3 months with each relative so he can decide where he is going to live. So all of the relatives kind of want that money and feel like Patrick should pick them. But nobody seems super interested in Patrick as a person. So Patrick starts off at Aunt Elizabeth's house. Everyone's nice-ish to him, but he feels like a stranger. And the only thing that is the saving grace about Aunt Elizabeth's house is that there is a window seat upstairs and he can see a house on a distant hill. And watching that house makes him feel less lonely and unwanted. So it kind of becomes the center of his dream life. He spends the rest of the year moving around to various relatives. At Aunt Fanny's house, there are cousins that tease him constantly. He goes to live with Aunt Lillian and distant cousin Miss Adams. They fuss over him constantly, but make him go to bed in the dark. And he hates being in, quote, a manless house. And then the last house is Aunt Melanie. And her house is a little better. She doesn't fuss at him. And she has a dog that Patrick loves. He can even see the house on the hill from one of the bedrooms. He's not unhappy there, but he's not really happy either because he doesn't feel like anyone genuinely likes him. And then on his birthday, the little dog is killed by a passing truck.
Oh.
Poor Patrick is so upset and miserable that he spontaneously jumps on a passing bus. He's always wanted to ride a bus, but hasn't been allowed to. He asks the driver how far he can get for 50 cents. Not all the way to Glen St. Mary to see the Blythes, his original plan, but he can go pretty far. So he's like, yep, take me as far as I can go. Patrick's grief is eventually surpassed by the pleasure of the bus ride, and the bus ends up taking him right up that hill, right past that house that he's always admired and built a fantasy life around. So he gets off there. The sign on the fence in front of the house says it's named Sometime Farm, with time being spelled Tyme. He's enchanted. And Patrick chats with the young man at the gate, and he confides his grief over his dog being killed. When he's asked his name, Patrick introduces himself as Pat Brewster. He's always wanted to be called Pat rather than Patrick. The man seems startled, but introduces himself as Barney Andrews. Barney invites him to come in for dinner with him and his elderly Aunt Holly. Pat has a great time. He has a delicious dinner. He helps Barney with fixing a fence. Thank you, Barney, for being the adult here. He calls down to Aunt Melanie to let her know where Pat is so she doesn't worry. And in the afternoon, a young woman neighbor named Barbara Ann comes over with a little girl that she's taking care of. A little girl they call Squaw Baby, so little racist there. And honestly, I don't have time to unpack this whole relationship relationship between Pat and Squaw Baby.
Yeah.
But read it for yourself, and I don't know. It's a very weird thing.
Extremely yikes all around.
But while Pat is kind of hanging out with the little girl, he overhears Barney and Barbara Ann talking. And from their talk, he puts together that actually Barney is his uncle. And Barney is about to lose Sometime Farm because he can't pay the mortgage. And it's clear that this also means that Barney can't marry Barbara Ann either. Turns out Barney's sister was Pat's mother, and all of the Brewsters looked down on her, didn't think she was good enough. So Barney didn't think he could make a claim on Pat because he's not as well off as the Brewsters, and he didn't think Pat would ever choose to live with him on kind of this ramshackle farm. But Pat overhears all this. He tells Barney no, he does want to live with him, and Barney realizes that Pat needs to be somewhere to belong and to be loved. So Barney says it's going to be worth the fight with the Brewsters, and Barbara Ann is delighted because she will stay and marry Barney now.
All right, so we are moving right along, everybody. There are still 2 more stories left in part 1. Fool's Errand is about Lincoln Burns, who had been taking care of his old mother for all his life, and she has just died. His sister Helen is after him to get married, and now none of the eligible ladies seem right to him. They are all too strong-minded, and he knows he's so laid back that he needs someone who understands him, but won't run roughshod over him. Lincoln remembers the only girl he ever felt that way about, a girl his age he met when he was about 10 at the seashore near his uncle's house, whose name was Janet. He had liked her so much he told her he would come back and marry her, but hadn't seen her since. He can't shake this memory of Janet, and so he finally sets off to go look for her. He visits his uncle, and he learns that Janet still lives with her parents nearby. His relatives think that Janet is too quiet and meek, but Lincoln is thrilled to hear about this, and he's nervous now to go up to Janet's house, but on a walk near the shore, he bumps into her. They recognize each other immediately, and they're comfortable walking quietly together. Finally, he blurts out, "Do you think you could marry me?" And Janet says yes. She's been waiting for him.
I mean, I love a fated mate, but also, like, it doesn't sound like he lived that far from his uncle's house this whole time. He could have gone back. It's like a buggy drive. It's not like even on the other end of the island.
Yeah, it's a strange one.
All right, so the last story in part 1 is called The Pot and the Kettle, and this is about Chrissy. She's a young woman about 20 years old, and she is unexpectedly visiting her old nurse that she calls Auntie Clack. Evidently, Chrissy is of the Clark family, who is quite wealthy. Don't confuse the Clarks and the Clacks.
Oh boy.
The Clark family is very wealthy, and Auntie Clack had been her nurse after her mother died in childbirth. So Chrissy was raised by her great aunt, Mrs. Clark, who is apparently quite controlling, and her father when he was around. And then when Auntie Clack retired, she bought a house out in Mowbray Narrows, and now Chrissy kind of just turned up on her step ready to visit for a month. Chrissy has just returned, as we open the story, from a local barn dance, one that the Blythe twins and Jem and Ken Ford had attended. And this must be just before Rilla of Ingleside starts, because Auntie Clack references that Ken Ford was probably sorry that Rilla wasn't there at the dance, which I don't think fits exactly with what we know about Ken and Rilla's timeline.
Yeah.
But fine, Maud threw it out there for a connection. The premise of the barn dance seems to be that each of the girls brings a pie, and then the boys bid on them, and then you eat the pie with the boy that bought yours. So Chrissy tells Auntie Clack that a young man named Don Glynn, who is the new gardener at a local home, bought hers, and she had a lovely time with him. Auntie Clack thinks he's beneath Chrissy, and that her great aunt would have a fit if she knew that Chrissy was eating pie with a gardener. But Chrissy says that Don was the handsomest man there, except for Jem Blythe, and she felt very at ease with him immediately. Chrissy seems smitten and says that Don is probably much handsomer than George. Who's George? Turns out George Fraser is the man that her father and her great aunt are determined that she will marry. Chrissy has never met him and won't marry him on principle. He is a third cousin who lives out west. Great Uncle Edward has recently died, and in his will, he has left all his money to George Fraser and Chrissy, but only if they marry each other before she's 21 a year from now. If they don't marry, then the money will go to a hospital. So her great aunt and her dad are like, no, you're getting married. And Chrissy is like, absolutely not. No way. Terrible plan. So Chrissy has been sent to Auntie Clack for a month to kind of give her space to come around on the idea of George. George had sent word saying he can't even come out to meet Chrissy until the fall because he's working. So Chrissy doesn't want to meet him, but she also thinks he's kind of snubbing her. So Auntie Clack thinks that Chrissy should keep her mind open because $5 million is a lot of money. But Chrissy is sure that George is probably ugly and boring, and she is determined to stick to her guns and marry for love someday. So Chrissy's like, I'm just going to spend this month enjoying this time out from under my great aunt's meddling and spending time with Dawn. And she may possibly have given Dawn the impression that she is a governess and that she is Auntie Clack's real niece. She's not a wealthy heiress. Dawn and Chrissy have a lovely time together over the next couple weeks. And, Chrissy starts falling in love, but she knows it can only be a flirtation because she's a Clark and he's working class. Finally, one evening, Dawn kisses her and says she has to marry him. And Chrissy's knows, okay, she's got to break up with him. It's not right to keep going like this. So first she tries to make him think that she was just flirting. It never meant anything. And then she confesses she's not actually a governess and that her last name is Clark. She'd been using her middle name as Dunbar as a last name. He's angry at the deceit. Chrissy is brokenhearted to end it, but she's still telling herself it was only a fun summer flirtation. So Chrissy goes back home, declaring to her great aunt that she won't marry George Fraser and she won't marry anyone ever. And her aunt's like, okay, kind of surprisingly. The next day, the despairing Chrissy, upstairs in her room, hears Dawn's whistle across the lawn, and she realizes as soon as she hears it that she had been lying to herself and to him when she said she didn't love him. She runs outside, and they have a romantic reunion. When they stop reunioning, he wonders how her family will feel about her being with a gardener. Chrissy says, well, they won't forgive her, but she doesn't care. And Dawn says, oh, they'll forgive Chrissy, but he hopes that Chrissy will forgive him.
Okay.
So he confesses that his name isn't Don Glynn. His name is George Donald Fraser. Glynn was his mother's last name.
Should have known.
He did come east to see Chrissy and to say he didn't want to marry for money. Send a letter. But he happened to arrive just as she was getting in the car to go visit Auntie Clack, and he fell for her instantly. It was the eyelashes.
Of course.
So he followed her to Mowbray Narrows, and he got a job because his hobby is gardening in order to meet her. And now he knows for sure that Chrissy isn't marrying him for money. All's well that ends well, but in one last aside to the reader, he thinks that actually, once he had seen Chrissy and he fell in love with her, he didn't follow her right that second. He went in to talk to her great aunt and father, and together the three of them concocted this plan to get around Chrissy's stubbornness, and he plans to never tell her that. Surely that will never come to light.
These are matchmaking shenanigans of which Anne Blythe could only dream.
Right. This is messy. And thus endeth part 1. Don't worry, readers. We've still got part 2.
There is still a part 2. Part 2 is a bit shorter, but part 2 of the Blythes Are Quoted takes place after World War I, and it begins with an explanation about Walter Blythe, explains that he was the poet of the family and that he had been killed during the First World War. When we are kind of having these interludes with the family around the fireside, Anne will often share one of Walter's poems and will alongside one of hers. The poems are very often in conversation with each other. So part 2 begins with Anne reading a handful of poems to the Blythes assembled in the living room. All these poems are about place, they're about seasons and home, nature, childhood, innocence, all these kind of themes that feel pretty typical for them. And so after that little poetical interlude, we dive back into the short stories with Brother Beware. Now, the Randabush household is a quiet, set in its ways house with Amos, his brother Timothy, and their housekeeper Matilda. Life has been exactly the same for years and years, basically since Amos's wife died. Amos is mild-mannered and easygoing. Timothy is stubborn and opinionated. But everything gets shaken up when a new woman, Alma Winkworth, shows up in town. She's charming and pretty, and she knows how to make an impression. She quickly befriends the Blythes, of course. Now, Amos Randabush falls for Alma hard. Suddenly, he's shaving, dressing up, and driving out to visit her every night. Timothy, the kind of ornery one who prides himself on distrusting women, it's a very attractive trait, is very suspicious. He thinks that Alma is a schemer who's trying to trap Amos into marriage. So Timothy takes it upon himself to solve this problem. And by solve, I mean he literally kidnaps Alma.
Oh my God.
Yes!
What is it? The meme that says men will literally kidnap a woman instead of going to therapy?
No, legit. Or the thing that this also made me think of was the show The Good Place, where Jason explains that sometimes he has a problem, but then when he throws a Molotov cocktail at the problem, now he has a different new problem. That's basically what happens here. Timothy creates a new problem by kidnapping Alma. So he tricks her into getting into his car under the pretense of giving her a ride to the train station. And then instead what he does is he boats her out to a remote island that is 4 miles from anywhere. And he leaves her there in a locked house. The thought being that this is going to keep her away from Amos long enough for his brother to let go of this crush and come to his senses. In Timothy's mind, not only is this a logical and flawless plan, but he even sort of like fancies himself as a hero.
I freed my brother from this woman's clutches.
Yep. But things don't go the way he expects, because when Timothy comes back to check on her, instead of being furious or hysterical, Alma is calm and gracious and dangerously kind to him. She cooks him amazing meals, she thanks him warmly, and she keeps asking him to stay and talk and hang out. Meanwhile, he kidnapped this woman and locked her in a house on an island. And slowly but surely, Timothy, who thought himself immune to the charms of women, starts falling for her himself. Meanwhile, Amos splits town entirely. Like, he just like leaves the picture. So there's no longer a reason to keep Alma stranded. She's not going to tempt him anymore. He's not even here. So Timothy goes back to the island to let her go, only to discover two big things. First, that Amos had already proposed to Alma before Timothy ever kidnapped her, and Alma had already turned him down. And second, that Alma actually likes Timothy.
Still,
shockingly. So, this is all wild stuff, right? And at this point, Timothy does the only thing he can do, basically just a complete 180, and he proposes to Alma himself, and she happily accepts. And then, of course, comes the final twist. As they're leaving the house, Timothy realizes that the door was never locked in the first place. Alma could have left anytime she wanted to. She just didn't want to. I actually quite like this one. I think it's funny and awry. This has a lot for me of like that kind of like signature Ella Montgomery sense of humor.
Well, we return to the Blythes hearth for more of Anne's poem and one of Walter's. Again, we have that call and response going between Walter's poems and Anne's. And Gilbert kind of observes that too, saying to Anne that the fact that she can write a lovely poem on the same topic as one of Walter's poems shows that the wound of her grief must be healing. And Anne agrees, but says that that scar will always be there. And Gilbert, of course, feels the same. They all do. And it's lovely that the way that they're keeping Walter's memory alive, even though it's painful, through his poetry. Our next story is Here Comes the Bride, which this one has got layers. On the surface, the story is about a fancy wedding in a beautiful old church. Picture perfect scene. The bride is even wearing Anne's pearl necklace for her something borrowed. And Diana Blythe is a bridesmaid. But then the real story is happening inside everyone's heads. So first we get the guests are sitting there waiting for the ceremony to start. And you get all this rapid fire tour of their thoughts. And as we have said, the Glen St. Mary crowd is judgy. These folks are definitely judgy. One aunt is convinced that the bride, Evelyn, is past her prime. She's manipulative. She's only marrying the groom, Darcy, as a backup after a rich guy dumped her. She scornfully judges everyone around her, including Anne, for assuming that it's a love match when it's obviously not. She thinks she's the only one who can see what's really happening. Another guest thinks the whole thing is basically doomed and gives the marriage 3 years max. Someone else is there to gossip about outfits, looks, weight, who's aging badly. Prue Davis is spiraling internally about being single and overlooked, and she's comparing her looks to the bridesmaids, not favorably. The best man thinks marriage is a trap. Everyone's got a take, and most of them are cynical, petty, or just plain wrong. Except I will point out that no one has anything hateful to say about the Blythes. Most are just observing that Anne still looks beautiful and young, and that the Blythe girls are effortlessly slender and graceful. The whole family is so classy.
It's the funniest thing because everyone is so negative about everyone else. And then they're like, oh, but that Anne Blythe is just as beautiful as she was the day we first laid eyes on her.
So then you get a peek inside the parents' heads. The parents are emotional but hopeful. The groom's mother is quietly supportive. The bride's father is proud and sentimental. And so then you start to see like, okay, well, maybe the judgy town gossip is not actually the situation. And then you get into the heads of the bride and groom themselves, and everything flips. Darcy, the groom, is deeply in love. He almost cannot believe that she's actually marrying him. Evelyn, the bride, is overjoyed, bursting with happiness and relief that she gets to marry him, not the other guy. Oh, these two, they're absolutely besotted with one another. So already we realize that all that outside speculation, all that idle gossip was completely off. And then here comes the best part. We get the truth revealed through the old family cook, Mary Hamilton, and she spills the story to her old pal, Susan Baker. Of course she does. Evelyn and Darcy have actually loved each other forever, but they're both stubborn, proud, and terrible at communicating. Another thread throughout this book.
Yep.
So instead of confessing their feelings, they spent years fighting, teasing, and making each other jealous. Everyone assumed they hated each other when really they were just in love and kind of clueless about it. Things got messy when Evelyn got engaged to another man. That's taking it too far, Evelyn. This other man, Elmer, she didn't love him. She basically got engaged out of pride and confusion. Meanwhile, her sister Marnie quietly fell in love with Elmer. So then, thank goodness, Mary Hamilton, the cook, absolute legend, she sees everything. So when she realizes what's really going on, she drives like a maniac to stop Darcy from leaving town, drags him back, forces the truth into the open, and then that sets off a chain reaction where Evelyn and Darcy finally admit they love each other, and Marnie and Elmer end up together because they're actually much better matched. So by the time we're at the wedding, everything has been beautifully sorted out thanks to Mary Hamilton. And then that's the heart of the story. From the outside, it looks like a second choice, slightly desperate marriage full of compromise. But in reality, it's a long overdue love story finally coming right.
It's a funny one because, the way it plays with, and this is another really common through line in this book, what is apparent on the surface is not usually real in any of these stories. What you think is happening is not what's actually happening. Well, so Anne shares a few more poems, 2 of her own and 1 of Walter's, and these poems are very, very sad. They are very clearly about grief and loss. In reading them, I really felt a lot of Anne reflecting not just on the grief and loss of Walter, but even like the grief and loss of Matthew. Everything that she's lived through kind of feels like it's just under the surface with these. It's fitting then that the next story, A Commonplace Woman, is a deathbed tale. In it, Ursula Anderson is dying slowly and she is inconveniencing everyone.
Totally.
How dare she? So the doctor, young Dr. Parsons, is annoyed because he will miss his chance to court the girl he wants to marry, and he only feels obligated to wait out Ursula's death because he wants the Andersons' business and their money. Meanwhile, Kathy and John Anderson are also very put out because they know the funeral is going to cost them money at a time when they have other expenses. The Andersons' children, Phil and Emmy, they are frustrated that they were kept home from a dance just to wait for an old lady to die. And this is kind of interesting because we do get the obligatory Blythe mention, but this time the Blythe mention we're getting, I think, is of like the next generation of Blythes, because they refer to Walter Blythe, but he's not our Walter. He's a son, I think, of Jem or of Shirley. They refer to a Gilbert Ford, who I think is probably Rilla and Ken Ford's son. These kids are like the same age as Anne and Gilbert's grandchildren. And these younger Anderson kids consider their old Aunt Ursula kind of a boring old maid, and they say to each other that she never lived and she never loved. And their Uncle Alec agrees. He calls her one of the forgotten commonplace women that no one thinks much of once they are past their prime. But I will say, for her part, Ursula is ready to die. She knows she's being pitied. She can feel the resentment wafting up to her, and she doesn't care because she knows that she wouldn't have traded her life for any other. And she reminisces about her life, which is so much more than her family seems to have ever known. Ursula recalls that she grew up with sisters who were all prettier than her, although her hands were always considered to be very beautiful. She felt like she was growing up in her sister's shadow and kind of under her mother's thumb while she was growing up. But Ursula's real adventures began when she was invited to stay with her Aunt Nan in Half Moon Cove. While she was staying in Half Moon Cove, Ursula met an English artist, Sir Lawrence Ainsley, who later became world famous, and they were lovers.
Oh, yeah, scandalous.
She recalled that, quote, "For that one enchanted summer, he loved her, and nothing could ever take that away from her." Ursula was also a hand model for Larry's art. At the end of this beautiful summer together, Larry goes back to England and Ursula finds out that she is pregnant. Her aunt helps her to hide the pregnancy to save her reputation, and the baby is adopted by a local family, a wealthier family, but one that Ursula kind of knew was tangentially connected to, and she felt safe giving them her daughter to raise. They named the little girl Isabel. Ursula now knows she has to provide for herself, so she learns to sew and she becomes a dressmaker. And this is the kind of dressmaker who will go into her clients' homes. One of those homes was Isabel's family, so she was basically able to watch her little girl grow up from afar. She was very much in the mix. Isabel grows up, she gets married, and Ursula is the one who's sewing her wedding dress in her trousseau. So she has this front row seat to her daughter's engagement, and she understands that her daughter is miserable because she's being matched with a man that she did not love. But it's kind of out of her control. The wedding goes on anyway, and soon Isabel's husband's affection, whatever little that there ever was, turned to hatred, and he became abusive to Isabel and to their little boy. He threatens to divorce her, he insults her for being adopted, and he told her that he would take their son away. And so meanwhile, Ursula is just sort of watching all of this go down, feeling helpless. One day, Ursula waits at the top of their stairs when the mean husband is drunk, and then pushes him down so hard that he breaks his neck, and she reveals reveals the truth of Isabel's parentage to him as he died.
Whoa!
Like, literally standing over him being like, I am her mother and her father is Sir Lawrence Ainsley, the great painter. In doing so, she has saved her daughter and her grandson, and she's paved their way for a safer life. And for years, Ursula is even sending them money anonymously so that way she can help them along. Ultimately, Isabel does go on to have a happy second marriage to a rich man in the United States, and Ursula keeps track of her daughter and of Larry through the newspapers. It turns out that Ursula's beautiful hands were immortalized in Larry's art and appear in galleries all over Europe. So here she is, lying on her deathbed. She'd never told these secrets to anyone, but as she's dying, she declares to herself, I have lived. I agree, Ursula, you definitely did, girl.
Wow, quite a life, Ursula. Well, Anne shares 4 more poems in the next interlude, 2 of hers and 2 of Walter's, and they're all about place and memory. So you can kind of see what Montgomery's working through and what through her Anne is working through.
Yeah.
The last short story of the book is called The Road to Yesterday, and it is a complete chaos spiral of a romance in the best way. So we're going to start with Suzette, a young girl who's a contemporary of Anne and Gilbert's grandchildren. She references Jem Blythe Jr. and a younger Anne Blythe. I'm guessing Jem and Faith's kids. Also, someone named Di Meredith, who I'm assuming that must be the child of Nan Blythe and Jerry Meredith. So the story is probably taking place the late 30s, early 40s, must be about 20 years after Willa of Ingleside. So anyway, Suzette is basically on the brink of getting engaged to Harvey Brooks, who is perfect on paper, rich, polished, socially ideal, big fancy house, fancier family. Suzette knows exactly what marrying him means, and she fully expects to say yes. We know how this goes. Anne was here with Roy Gardner. The only problem is that Suzette is just not excited at all. She should be thrilled, but instead she feels suffocated. Everything about this world she's marrying into seems stiff and controlled and kind of a little soul crushing. Harvey is nice, but safe to the point of being dull. And Suzette starts realizing that marrying him might mean becoming just like him, and the thought makes her feel trapped. So she does what any slightly rebellious heroine would do. She sneaks off for a drive to a place from her childhood called Peggy's Point. And at Peggy's Point, she runs into Dick, a boy she used to hate as a kid. Back then, he was annoying, mean, a total pest. But now he's grown up, and suddenly he's charming and funny and adventurous. He's literally an aviator. Very compelling. He compliments her lovely gray-green eyes, which remind him of Mrs. Dr. Blythe. And if there's one through line in the short story collection, it's that everyone is absolutely obsessed with Anne's appearance.
I mean, at this point, Anne is 60, and he's all like that little old lady with the beautiful eyes.
No, so he's got to be early 20s, and he's all like, your eyes are so beautiful. They remind me of this lady who lives down the way.
It's so silly.
And Suzette thinks that this compliment is lovely, but does recognize it a little odd because Dick never liked Mrs. Blythe, and now he's complimenting her eyes. But yeah, keep that in mind, folks. So Dick and Suzette spend the afternoon together, wandering around her old childhood haunts, getting stuck in a thunderstorm, and they end up inside sharing tea and memories. Dick is able to rustle up a halfway decent tea, having spent time at Ingleside with Susan and the Blythes at one point. I mean, who is this guy?
Yeah, seriously.
Why is she teaching him how to cook?
Who knows?
So slowly, almost against her will, Suzette starts feeling things, real things. Not the polite, sensible affection she has for Henry, but something that is electric, alive, and a little dangerous. And she tries to fight it, tries to remind herself that she hates Dick, but it's clearly not working. And by the next morning, she knows she's in trouble, like I might fall in love with the wrong man in 24 hours trouble. They have this dreamy sunrise breakfast by the lake, wild strawberries, bacon, and coffee, and a romantic scene moment. And Dick's like, yes, let's run off. Let's get married right now and start a life together. It sounds completely insane, except Suzette realizes she wants to say yes. Right at that emotional peak, though, comes the twist. Turns out Dick isn't actually Dick. He's Jerry, Dick's cousin. He let her think he was Dick because he thought she'd leave too quickly otherwise if he was just a stranger. And he knew about her from family stories and basically seized the moment to win her over.
To which I can only say, hello, Anne's House of Dreams. Leslie Moore, your love story is calling.
This is kind of like if it went well, if that love story had went
Right.
well.
This is the inverse version of it.
Also, apparently in this story, the real Dick, still apparently awful. He's already married, so no loss there. But instead of being horrified at this deception, Suzette rolls with it. So she chooses Jerry with the adventure, the unpredictability, the real connection over Harvey and his perfectly curated, perfectly boring world.
Good for you, Suzette. Go get him, girl. So the book ends with 4 poems, and all 4 of these are attributed to Walter. And I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to discuss Wilfred Owens and Siegfried Sassoon a little bit over the course of the season. Those were those World War I era poets who wrote so beautifully, but also so critically of the war. And that's important context to have because the last of these 4 poems is called The Aftermath. And this is very much in the same tone. It's a bleak and terrifying little poem that dwells on the loss of innocence and humanity that war requires. And it ends with this absolutely bone-chilling line. The wind has voices that may not be stilled, the wind that yester morning was so blithe, and everywhere I look I see him writhe, that pretty boy I killed. Anne reads that poem aloud, but only to Jem, and Jem assures his mother that Walter never did take a life himself, but that he did see killing, and that it affected him deeply. Anne and Jem quietly agree that Walter could never have lived with his memories had he returned home from the war. And that is the deeply tragic way that this book ends.
It is such a sad ending.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, a lot of the stories throughout this book have been a lot darker in tone than maybe some of her usual fare. But this is, it feels like the only really specific critique of war and killing in any of her books. And it's a little, I wouldn't say graphic, but a little bit, right? Like
it's graphic. It's graphic. It's interesting too because there's like a symbolic through line of the wind throughout but many of the poems read throughout the book. And then of course in this very last stanza of the last poem of the book, we return to this, the wind has voices that may not be stilled. The wind that yester morning was so blithe. That word choice is not an accident, right?
No.
And then this is very graphic, Ragon, I think. The quote, and everywhere I look, I see him writhe, that pretty boy I killed. Like that is a freaking gut punch.
I also think it's interesting the little convo that Jem and Anne have, where Jem is trying to reassure both himself and Anne that Walter did not kill anybody like this. How would Jem know that?
Jem doesn't know that.
Jem doesn't know that. And I don't know if he's saying that to reassure Anne so that Anne doesn't have that thought that her poetic, gentle son participated in such a horrific way, or if he's saying it for himself or some of both. Jem's first instinct is to say, oh no, Walter, he's writing that from somebody else's point of view. He himself would never have killed somebody up close like that. But how would Jem have known that?
Well, and I think the other sort of like metatextual reading too is that Jem is saying that for the reader.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's giving them an out if they want it.
Yeah.
If you want the out and you don't want to think about Walter in this specific way, we can make it more he was writing about the experience in general, not his experience. But I think she's also leaving that door open. But if you want to know, this is what the war did to him. There's almost this like romantic, like he refers to the boy he killed as pretty. Romantic, but not in a romantic sense. Do you know what I mean? This idea.
No, I know completely what you mean, right? I'm not talking about love and romance, but talking about the romance of youth.
You know, one of the things we kind of talked about our episode about Jem, and we had talked a little bit about kind of like the dehumanization of the enemy in order to allow you to kill them. And this is the opposite of that. It's humanizing him. He's not ugly, faceless monster. This boy that he killed was young and beautiful.
Yeah, he's not a Hun. Yeah, this is a devastating, devastating poem, the whole thing. Suffice it to say, a very dark way to end the book.
Yeah, it's not a comfortable way to end the book. It's not wrapping up our experience with Anne and the Blythes in a happy ever after bow.
Well,
all right, listeners. Yeah. Thanks for going along with us on this one. Let's jump into some inspired buys to wrap up this episode. We'll have more thoughts about the Blythes Are Quoted next episode.
Well, so I'm inspired. The short story that really inspired my recommendation is The Road to Yesterday because it has the exact same sort of like plot as one of my favorite musical theater songs, which then that reminded me of one of my favorite early 90s musicals, which happens to have a very similar episodic structure to the Blythes Are Quoted entirely. So I'm recommending the musical Songs for a New World by Jason Robert Brown. This is a very abstract musical, very like early 90s. It's super of its time. It's more like a concert of songs than a cohesive show, except for the fact that all the songs are connected by one loose theme, which is the moment of decision. And I think that that is kind of a similar thing that we see with, there's one song that is basically the plot of Road to Yesterday, and this song is called Stars in the Moon. Beautiful, beautiful song. It's about a woman who is tempted by three potential lovers, each of whom offers her something different. One offers her adventure, one offers her true love, and one offers her wealth and security. And over the course of the song, she makes the choice of who to be with. It's a really thrilling piece of music, a gorgeous song. So we will drop a link to one of my favorite performances of Stars in the Moon in the show notes.
Amazing. I have never heard that. So I am looking forward to hearing that.
You'll enjoy it. You really will.
Well, this is such a wild and diverse collection of stories. I was kind of having difficulty deciding what I was inspired by. It was sort of all over the place. So I'm going to do a completely frivolous recommendation for some skincare. I have been loving the face mask from Bioma. It's called the Biocollagen Radiance Facial Mask. And it's a peel-off mask, but it's not that like super tight stripping kind.
Yeah.
It kind of like tugs at your skin when you pull it off. You smooth it on, you let it dry till it turns clear, and then you peel it off. It's very satisfying. You can peel it off in like one layer.
Ooh.
And then your skin is super radiant and moisturized. Oh, I actually am glowing after using it.
Yes.
So if you want super glowy skin, this is a very fun product. It'll make you as beautiful as Anne Blythe.
Well, that is a great recommendation. Yes, we all want to have Anne Blythe's beautiful complexion, which the townsfolk of Glen St. Mary cannot get enough of.
Right. Still, when she's 60, they're still talking about it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kindred Spirits. If you had fun on today's episode, or perhaps if you learned something new about the Blythes Are Quoted, we would so appreciate it if you would leave us a 5-star rating or review wherever you listen, or if you would share about the podcast on social media. As a thank you, if you email us a screenshot or let us know that you've rated or reviewed, we will send you one of our beautiful sage green Kindred Spirits Book Club logo stickers. Kindred Spirits, this has been quite an episode. The Blythes Are Quoted is a fascinating book on a lot of different levels, and we are going to continue talking about it next week with Benjamin Lefebvre. We could not possibly have a better guest for that particular episode. We cannot wait for you all to join us and learn from the master.
Bye, Kindred Spirits.